If you're a millennial, you've probably had a moment where you look around and think, should I feel more grown up than this? Not in a dramatic way, more like a quiet confusion. You can pay bills, solve problems, and handle responsibilities, but the inner feeling of being an adult doesn't always arrive on schedule. Sometimes it feels like you're doing adulthood rather than inhabiting it. And when you hear someone say, people your age should have it figured out by now, it can land like a strange accusation because you've been trying. You've just been trying in a world that keeps moving the finish line. Delayed adulthood isn't just about living with parents longer or waiting to get married or having a slower career path. It's a psychological pattern that shows up in identity, nervous system load, and the way your brain calculates risk. Research shows that the markers people once used to define adulthood were heavily tied to stability. Stable housing, stable work, stable social roles, and predictable paths. When those conditions become less reliable, the brain doesn't just keep following the old timeline. It starts optimizing for survival, flexibility, and emotional safety instead. One of the biggest shifts for millennials is that many grew up with the promise that effort leads to security. Then adulthood introduced a more complicated reality. Studies suggest that when people face repeated uncertainty, their planning system changes. Long-term commitments don't feel like milestones. They can start to feel like traps. Not because you're afraid of responsibility, but because your nervous system is trying to avoid getting stuck in something that could collapse. That's why settling down can feel less like a natural next step and more like a high-stakes decision that requires perfect timing, perfect finances, and perfect certainty that rarely exists. This also affects identity. Psychological studies indicate that identity formation isn't something that ends at a certain age. It's influenced by whether your environment allows experimentation without severe penalties. When people have room to try, fail, and recover, they tend to consolidate identity sooner. When every mistake feels expensive, identity can stay more fluid because your brain keeps searching for the safest option. You might keep rethinking your path not because you're indecisive, but because your mind is scanning for stability in a landscape that doesn't offer it easily. There's also a cultural layer that complicates the inner feeling of being adult. Millennials were raised during a time where self-awareness became a norm. You learn to talk about feelings, mental health, boundaries, and personal growth. Researchers have found that increased self-monitoring can improve emotional insight, but it can also create a constant inner commentary. So instead of simply living through a stage of life, you're also evaluating it. Am I behind? Am I wasting time? Am I making the right choice? That mental narration can make adulthood feel less like a state you arrive at and more like a test you keep taking. Delayed adulthood can also be understood through the nervous system. Recent research suggests that chronic stress and uncertainty keep the body in a more vigilant state, even when nothing is actively wrong in the moment. If your baseline includes financial strain, unstable housing, unpredictable work demands, or constant social comparison, your system doesn't fully relax. And when your system doesn't relax, big commitments don't feel exciting. They feel heavy. The brain tends to prioritize short-term control when long-term safety feels unclear. That can look like postponing major decisions, but internally it often feels like waiting for the moment when your body finally believes it's safe enough to commit. Social comparison intensifies this. Millennials grew into adulthood alongside a world where people publicly display progress. Psychological studies indicate that repeated exposure to curated milestones can distort what normal looks like. It's not just seeing someone succeed, it's seeing success presented as effortless, perfectly timed, and universally achievable. That can create a quiet pressure to match an invisible timeline, even if you don't believe in the timeline. You might feel behind, even while doing well, because your mind keeps measuring your life against a highlight reel of other people's lives. Relationships can reflect the same dynamic. For some millennials, partnership and family decisions carry more weight because they're expected to meet emotional needs, financial needs, and identity needs all at once. Researchers have found that when people feel uncertain about external stability, They may seek internal stability through relationships, but they may also fear the risk of dependence. So you can want closeness and still feel cautious. You can want a future and still worry about choosing wrong. Delayed adulthood here doesn't always mean avoiding commitment. Sometimes it means needing more evidence that the foundation is strong before you build on it. Another piece is the meaning gap. Millennials were often encouraged to pursue fulfillment, passion, and purpose. That can be a strength. It can also create pressure. Studies suggest that when people link identity to work, uncertainty in work can feel like uncertainty in self. So if your career path is nonlinear, or if you're constantly adapting, you might not just feel professionally unsettled, you might feel personally unsettled. That doesn't mean you're immature. It means your sense of adulthood is tied to coherence, and coherence is harder to sustain in a world that rewards constant reinvention. The consequences of delayed adulthood are not always visible, but they are real. It can affect self-image because you may interpret uncertainty as personal failure rather than environmental reality. It can affect decisions because you may overthink choices to avoid regret. It can affect mental energy because staying flexible requires constant recalibration. And it can affect relationships because it's hard to feel fully present when part of your mind is always calculating what the next adjustment needs to be. But there's also another side to this psychology that often gets ignored. A delayed timeline can produce a different kind of maturity. The maturity of adapting without collapsing, of learning emotional language, of noticing patterns, of building identity through reflection instead of rushing into roles. Research shows that resilience isn't only about enduring hardship. It can also be about learning how to stay psychologically intact while the external world remains uncertain. Many millennials have become skilled at that, even if it doesn't look like the traditional version of adulthood. So if adulthood has felt delayed, it may not be because you missed something everyone else found. It may be because your brain has been navigating a world where stability is no longer assumed, and the old milestones don't always fit the new reality. And noticing that can shift the story from "I'm behind" to "I'm adapting," which is a different kind of clarity. If this felt familiar, you can like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who's been quietly wondering the same thing.